Hello, everyone. I'm Sandy Rosenthal with Beat the Big Guys podcast, and I'm so excited about my guest today, Ms. Carey Gillam. Let me start out by telling you a little bit about her. Investigative journalist Carey Gillam has spent more than 25 years researching the food and agrochemical industry, spending most of her career with the international news agency Reuters. Now she has two books that reveal decades of corporate secrets and deceptive tactics by the powerful pesticide companies, including the global giant Monsanto. Carey's 2017 book, Whitewash, The Story of a Weed Killer, Cancer, and the Corruption of Science, won tons of awards, including the 2018 Rachel Carson Book Award from the Society of Environmental Journalists. That's an amazing award, among others. And in Carey's words, this book is more of a textbook. And so along comes a second book released in March of this year, The Monsanto Papers, Deadly Secrets, Corporate Corruption, and One Man's Search for Justice. Is more of a story and described by one reviewer as blending science and human tragedy with courtroom drama in the style of John Grisham. And I completely agree because I'm about halfway through. It's a page turner. Corporate powers have attempted to silence and harass Gillum. Monsanto even I'm going to suggest I'm starting again with that one.
Okay.
Corporate powers have attempted to silence and harass Carey. Monsanto even created a secret project aimed at discrediting her, according to internal corporate documents uncovered through the litigation. At this time, Carey works as a health and environmental researcher at the nonprofit group U.S. Right to Know and a news contributor to The Guardian. Carey, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I really think that your work as an investigative journalist has will be a great way if you tell your story. It will be a great way to help our listeners learn that you don't have to be an expert in the chemical industry to beat the chemical industry. Okay, it takes a lot of things, but you don't have to necessarily be an expert right from the start. And so, in addition to all of the other things that you can provide. So, Carey, why don't you go ahead and just tell your story about how you stood up to one of the biggest big guys of all, Monsanto?
Gosh, it's a long story. So I've been a reporter, ever since I got out of college. I always wanted to be a journalist. I always thought that there was probably no better career to choose, no better job in the world. Essentially, when you're a journalist, you get paid to go out in the world and learn about really interesting, important, sometimes historic events and issues and things that really matter, right, to all of us. And then you get to tell the world about it. So I always knew I wanted to be a journalist, and I started out really very early on covering corporate issues, business and corporate America, and kind of worked my way up. I was covering large bank holding companies in the 1990s when Reuters, the international news agency, asked me to move to Kansas and start covering agriculture, food, and farming. There was this company called Monsanto that had just rolled out genetically engineered crops. And these crops were, unlike anything really that farmers had ever had before. They had their DNA spliced with genes from outside the species. They were transgenic, essentially. And Monsanto had been able to alter them so that they could be sprayed directly with a weed killer, an herbicide. Monsanto owned Roundup, glyphosate-based herbicide, and they really wanted a way to encourage and increase use of Roundup. So they developed these glyphosate tolerant or Roundup ready crops. Farmers could plant them right in their fields, and then they could spray directly over the crops, and the crops wouldn't die, but the weeds would. And it, for somebody outside of farming, maybe it doesn't sound very remarkable, but what I learned very quickly in starting to cover this industry was that it was miraculous for farmers. They loved this new invention and this new technology because it made farming a lot easier for them.
And
And of
what
course,
about what year was this
this was
around?
the late 1990s.
Okay.
And I was learning everything I could, of course, about not only Monsanto, but the very other large companies that were really starting to take a dominant role in agriculture. These companies were very important in industrial chemicals and in providing chemicals for warfare. But when we entered into this period where we weren't at war with anybody, they needed new uses for their chemicals. And so a lot of them started getting into agriculture. And so Monsanto and Dow and DuPont were very heavily invested. And they were, as I said, really revolutionizing and industrializing agriculture. So it was a very big and very important beat for me to learn about and to make sure that I understood. I was writing for people around the world through Reuters. So, I dug in like you do as a journalist.
If
And
I could interrupt just for a second, at that time, did it seem almost too good to be true?
well, I don't know. I mean, for me, again, I was learning. I hadn't covered
Mhm.
food and farming. Most of the coverage of these new GMO crops was positive. There were certainly a lot of people who were worried about them, but the companies were saying these are going to help us feed the world. We're also going to roll out GMO crops that are going to yield better and taste better and grow well without water, in drought situations. And will require less fertilizer. There were all of these really big promises.
I remember this very, very well. And I remember I didn't think it was too good to be true. I thought, well, finally, a good story. That was all I
Yeah,
thought about it at the time.
yeah. And so Monsanto did what companies do is they invited me into their headquarters and they spent a lot of time trying to teach me the way to write about their company and to write about their products. Dow and DuPont did the same thing, Syngenta, all of these big companies, because I was working for such a big and influential news agency, they spent a lot of time wooing me and trying to make sure that I understood the business from their perspective and the hope that I would write about it from their perspective. But I also did what good journalists do. I developed other sources and I spent a lot of time with scientists, with farmers, with weed scientists, with some people who worked in the regulatory regime, academics, professors, people who, came from a different perspective to understand this. And I learned and came to understand over the years that I covered this, that there was a dark side, if you will, or there were things that the companies had been hiding, and there were very real risks that were coming along with the rewards that
And
these.
about where are we now in timeline?
So early 2000s, I
Okay.
suppose, early 2000s,
Okay.
and then mid, and then late, and I, particularly with this chemical glyphosate that Monsanto was pushing, Roundup is based on this chemical glyphosate. Glyphosate became the most widely used weed killing agent in the world. Thanks to Monsanto. It became ubiquitous in our environment because Monsanto pushed it to such widespread use. Government scientists were finding it in water, in air samples, even in rainfall. It was found, in food samples. Monsanto kept going back to the government asking for increased allowances to have residues of its weed killer in food. So, as the science built, and I was writing about the science and about the concerns and growing evidence that this chemical could be linked to cancer and other health problems, as well as a whole array of environmental problems, Monsanto decided that, I was somebody they needed to shut up and shut down. And they stopped wooing me and they started trying to harass me, intimidate me. I mean, we can get into it. There've been a whole array of tactics that they've deployed to try to take me down, I guess, tried to interfere with my work.
If you could share what one or two, I'm interested.
Well, there's so many. I mean,
I know.
when I was at Reuters, they spent quite a lot of time trying to harass me, my editors, trying to, just really influence the coverage and get me or get my editors to stop allowing stories about the scientific studies, for instance, that showed harm with their products. And so that was one thing. when I left Reuters and I wrote my first book, that sort of exposed a lot of the deceptive tactics that the company had engaged in and a lot of the collusion with regulators that I was able to uncover by gathering data and documents. They developed a whole internal strategic plan to discredit the book, and that involved, we got copies through litigation, copies of their internal documents against me, and showed that they were going to manipulate search engine optimization so that, for instance, if people went on Google and Googled my name and glyphosate, for instance, they would then be directed automatically to web links that Monsanto wanted them to see.
Wow.
And they talked about how they were going to do that. They talked about how to get negative book reviews posted about my book that looked like they didn't come from Monsanto, that looked like they came from, just third-party regular folk.
And they had it in writing.
They had it in writing. They had a spreadsheet. It was a pretty long list of tasks. It was called the Carey Gillam book plan.
Wow. If that's not a sign you're effective, I don't know what is.
So, I've uncovered, and others have uncovered a lot of similar tactics that they've employed to silence anybody really that is pointing to, harm or risk or red flags with their products. We also have evidence that they've paid a lot of money to front groups, to organizations that again look like they're independent, look like they're maybe science organizations or consumer organizations, and they have paid money to these groups. And then these organizations, there's one called the American Council on Science and Health, for instance. And that group, if you go on their website and you put in Carey Gillam, you'll see that they have written just a slew of articles about me and, said that just terrible things about me, really, that aren't true. But our internal emails that we've been able to get show that Monsanto was paying them money and talking about how you won't get a better value for your dollar than ACSH, this sort of thing. So it's
in America, excuse me, in America, these are not illegal. It is not illegal for organizations to pay a front group to pretend it's a real grassroots group. It's all too common. However, to be discovered is very embarrassing. And obviously they were discovered. We're here talking about it now.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, I've been able to get a lot of documents. I've gotten thousands of pages actually that I, used to write my 2 books. But from filing Freedom of Information Act requests, I sued the EPA twice actually to get documents, and the FDA one time, but have gotten a lot of internal documents showing communications back and forth between the regulators, which are really alarming because they really show a loyalty to the company, not really to public health. But we also have then thousands of documents through this litigation that are directly just Monsanto internal records talking amongst themselves about all of these really deceptive plans to deceive consumers and farmers and lawmakers. And there's one federal judge involved in this Roundup litigation who has commented more than once, and he did again just recently, that all of this evidence shows that Monsanto really didn't care about public health. They cared about protecting their product, but not about protecting the public.
So when did you feel that you had made huge progress or won? Can you tell us about that?
Oh gosh, well, I mean, it's funny because when my first book came out, Whitewash, in 2017, the Roundup litigation, these are cancer patients that have sued Monsanto, alleging that exposure to Roundup caused them to develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And several people have died, but there are over 100,000 people now that have sued the company because the evidence really that this causes cancer and that the company covered it up, the evidence is just overwhelming. And there have been 3 trials. All 3 trials, the juries have voted unanimously in favor of the plaintiffs, and they've awarded huge amounts of money. So, it's really not a doubt any longer. And my first book came out though before any of the trials, and there were a lot of people who were skeptical. I remember other reporters at other organizations, doubting me and being very skeptical. And now these same people will come to me and say, man, wow, like you were right. How do you feel? Do you feel? And I said, well, I always knew I was right. I mean, that was really never a question. I mean, the data is not disputable. But Bayer bought Monsanto, the giant German pharmaceutical. And in late July, they said they were going to pull Roundup from the market. They want
Late July of this year.
July of 2021, they said they are not going to sell it to US consumers anymore. Now they're going to continue to sell to farmers and commercial applicators. But, that to a degree, I did get a lot of emails from people thanking me, saying all of your work exposing all of this, contributed to this move. I don't know if that's true or not. But I do think it's important. All of my work as a journalist, it's not about a commercial outcome. My work as a journalist is about bringing information to light, truthful information that's important for public health, public policy, that people have a right to know because it affects all of us, affects our health. I mean, that's my job. That's the job as a journalist. So that's what I've done. And hopefully it has made a difference. I guess I don't know for sure, but I hope it has.
Well, I am so very impressed because it sounds to me that the work you did, it was never about you or about your career. It was always about what you were doing. That's how it sounds to me. And it looks like the dog got out. I'm going to pause for a second. Okay. My husband let the dog out.
Darn husband.
Pause.
Darn dog.
That's him banging on the door. I'm going to pause. And I am so very grateful for what you've done because I can tell, I can see, I've already read that they tried to go after you when they realized they couldn't talk about the data because they were wrong. They went after you. And that's a classic sign that you're on the right track, but you hung in there because it sounds like that harassment must have been pretty awful. I'd love to talk just for a moment about something I read on page 50 of your book, which is pretty shocking to me. On page 50, it talks about how the Miller firm, that was the firm that was representing Mr. Lee, who had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and they met with Monsanto's lawyers. And at the time, Monsanto seemed totally unconcerned. Monsanto seemed like they were untouchable, okay? And then as soon as the Miller firm got a hold of some emails, apparently a Monsanto, excuse me, restarting Jess. Apparently an expert named James Perry had gone to Monsanto and was concerned because the company's products appeared to be dangerous. And in an email, a Monsanto toxicologist, William Haydens, wrote, we are not going to do the studies that this expert suggests we do. In fact, instead, we're going to focus on seeking out a different expert who could be influential with regulators. And this is in writing.
Right.
In an email. So, and the reason I find this interesting is, and this is, I'd like to bring some encouragement to our listeners by telling them that doing stuff like this is not uncommon. These huge corporations with tons of money and tons of power do stuff like this all the time. They somehow they rise to a level of thinking nobody can touch them and that nobody can stop them. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, that Perry incident that you've described there, yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. And that actually, when you look at the totality of the evidence, in my mind anyway, that's, well, it was kind of middle of the road. I mean, in terms of the wrongdoing or the misconduct that you see, yeah, Perry was an expert. Monsanto brought him in because there were a lot of outside independent scientific research papers being published showing problems, genotoxicity concerns with Monsanto's herbicide, and they brought Perry in, and Perry kind of agreed, and he said, yeah, it looks like there's genotoxicity issues, and you should probably do more studies to make sure your product isn't causing cancer. And Monsanto basically, as you wrote or said there, said, yeah, no, or that's not our interest. Our interest is in somebody who's going to help us
We'll
with.
just get another expert, and one with influence with the regulators,
Yeah,
and it's in writing.
yeah,
And it doesn't surprise me. I also stood up against a big guy. That was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and I found emails, things put in writing that are absolutely shocking. And I think these large corporations, they seem so unbeatable, but they are beatable because they do things like we've just described. They put things in writing that are damning,
right.
incredibly damning.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, unfortunately, and I was just talking to somebody about this today, and there's more evidence that's come out. Here, we've recently had 4 whistleblowers from the EPA come out and essentially say, there's scientists who work in the EPA, and they are providing evidence. They provide internal emails, again, these are from the EPA, but they are talking about how these big companies, and this would be like a Monsanto, a Bayer, a Dow, a DuPont. These big companies want their chemicals approved, and you scientists who are finding problems with them, you better shut up. And these scientists have reported that when they find a cancer risk or a developmental risk, neurotoxicity, their managers in the EPA are saying, no, the companies want these approved and they want them approved really fast. And sometimes they override these scientists and they delete language about the risks, and they help the companies hide the risks. These are the EPA officials. So, right now, when you and I are speaking here in August of 2021, these whistleblowers from the EPA have asked Congress to investigate, the Office of Inspector General. They are trying to blow the whistle, if you will. And they're saying that this wasn't just part of past administrations, it's the Biden administration as well
Mm.
that is pushing this loyalty to companies over loyalty to public health. So it's a really, really big and really important issue.
I think you raise a good point, Carey, that these problems are not administration to administration specific. They are not. These problems go on for decades. It'd be nice to think an administration could clean everything up. And that's a subject of another book. I've got another one right here, Why Presidents Fail. But yeah, you can't just depend on a new administration to just fix everything, even though they try. I wanted to touch for just a moment on, you talked about Freedom of Information Act and the value of a Freedom of Information Act, and how in certain situations you had to, even though it's the law that they're supposed to comply, you had to actually threaten them with lawsuit. Could you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah. The Freedom of Information Act is over 50 years old. It's a law that is designed to essentially, ensure democracy and ensure the citizens' right to transparency with the way our government acts on our behalf. They're spending our tax dollars, and they're supposed to be representing and protecting our interests. So this FOIA, as we call it, is the tool that anyone can use to make a request to a federal agency. There are also state record requests that, an institution, any public institution
Mhm.
that relies on tax dollars, you have the right to go to them and ask for documents, records, information, and they are legally
Anybody, anybody,
anyone,
anybody.
right? And they are supposed to turn it over. Now, of course, there are different exemptions and provisions and loopholes, if you will, but it really is probably the very best tool you have to get real information, to get an inside look at what the agencies are doing. But they do oftentimes make it really hard for you to get the information.
And
And
then what? Then what do you do?
well, then you sue them, which is what I've done. And I recently just did one at a state university, and they're exorbitant costs associated with it. They want several hundreds and hundreds of dollars for just a few pages of records, and then they blank out a lot of information when you finally do get the records. I mean, they do make it difficult, but if you're devoted to it and dedicated, and you have the time and the energy and the resources, that is a tool, and it's a tool journalists use all the time.
It's a great tool, and I'd like to elaborate just for a moment that the Freedom of Information, a request under the FOIA is free, and usually they don't charge you money. Usually they don't, but if they do, and you are a community member just trying to sound the horn, you can just tell everybody, look, this organization, this university or whatever it is charging me money, for information that we have a right to have. And then that will enrage, and that will and spur more people to get involved. And that might, sometimes that's just enough to get the organization to back down and say, here you go, here's your information. It's a delay tactic. I
Right.
feel
And I,
strongly it's a delay tactic. Mhm.
yeah, and I should point out, you're right. I mean, most of the federal agencies don't charge exorbitant fees. A lot of the state institutions do, but and even when you sue, I mean, if you follow the procedures and you do it correctly, filing a lawsuit isn't that big of a deal, actually, because they're going to find in your favor, and then the EPA or whoever it is pays the legal costs associated with that. And it's just sort of the standard way that it has happened, at least in my experience.
It's again a delay tactic. It slowed you down a little bit, but in the end, you got your information. And I can elaborate just a tiny little bit on that. That happened to me twice. I applied for information under the FOIA with the Army Corps of Engineers, and 6 months later, they still had not given me a single word. So what I did is I threatened lawsuit. I didn't file. I threatened it. And I said, if I don't have at least a partial fulfillment, and this was Christmas Eve, I said, by New Year's Eve, I will be filing lawsuit. And sure enough, the following Monday, I got a pack of data this thick that was a part of the data. And all I had to do was threaten. And the bottom line is, not every time, but the bottom line is, it's a delay tactic. They'll try anything. But the number one trick of the big guys is delay, stall, non-answer, non-reply, and just don't let them do it. And you'd be surprised how much one person, has with this wonderful law that's 50 years old, that any person in the country is free to use. And the last thing I wanted to mention, I found it so interesting that in the beginning, before Monsanto saw you as a threat, they tried to be your buddy and invited you in to their offices, and tried to help you see their point of view. It sounded like they started out trying to be your friend. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty common, in the banking industry, any of the industries I've ever covered, healthcare, banking, insurance, and the ag chem industry. And they do it with very large publications, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Bloomberg, Reuters, Dow. If you're a large news organization and there's influence in the stories that you write, of course, they're going to want to woo you and to be your buddy and to be your friend. And there's a lot of that goes on. And I don't know that that's unethical. I think that's just sort of the nature of the beast. But, any good journalist is going to learn everything that they can, right? But then also go to other sources and try to have a balanced and honest approach to the stories that they write.
Right. And then you became effective, and then they shut down. And then what you very well described, the harassment campaign began. And on that note, is there any word of encouragement you can give, the would-be community organizer out there that's thinking of standing up to the big guys? Any word of encouragement you can give them for when that potential harassment campaign comes along?
I think I would say, I've been affected. Obviously, there've been times when I've been, I don't know, afraid, I guess, is that the right word? I've had some fear and been upset with the things I see written about me online. But I think you keep your head down, you shut out the noise, and you stay true to your task, and whatever that is, and you arm yourself with data, facts, data. It can't be hyperbole. It can't be emotional. It has to be real, and take the facts to the people who need to know them and need to see them. And, there are very real risks with these chemicals that I write about, and these pesticides and things that are used every day, and these companies that are pushing them ever more present into our lives. And unfortunately, our regulators are not doing a lot to protect us. So it's up to the people to do that. But there's plenty of information. You got to stick to it, and you got to be not afraid to make people mad, I guess.
That
Not afraid.
that is very, very, very encouraging. And I hope all of you heard every word, because I couldn't agree more with everything that you've just said. And the only thing I can add is you knew in your heart you were right. You knew you were right. You knew you were onto something, and you stuck with it. And you could even see the people who are being affected by this, the people affected by this, by the Roundup. It's heartbreaking to listen to their health effects they're having. It's really having an effect on me. So thank you for sticking with it. Thank you for all of the work that you've done. Thank you for the words of encouragement and advice that you've given to all of our listeners today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the work you're doing. I appreciate it.
Oh, I'm just getting started. But thank you so much. And thank you again, Carey, for joining me. I hope all of you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you too can beat the big guys. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording.
Great.
Yeah.
You're good at
No,
that.
I think